Chapter 11 of the Paradise Mystery. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Gesine. The Paradise Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 11. The Back Room. In the midst of all her perplexity at that moment, Mary Bewery was certain of one fact about which she had no perplexity nor any doubt. It would not be long before the rumours of which Bryce and Mr. Folliot had spoken. Although she had only lived in Wrychester a comparatively short time, she had seen and learned enough of it to know that the place was a hotbed of gossip. Once gossip was started there, it spread, widening in circle after circle. And though Bryce was probably right when he said that the person chiefly concerned was usually the last person to hear what was being whispered, she knew well enough that sooner or later this talk about Ransford would come to Ransford's own ears. But she had no idea that it was to come so soon, nor from her own brother. Lunch in the Ransford menage was an informal meal. At 1:15 every day it was on the table, a cold lunch to which the three members of the household helped themselves as they liked, independent of the services of servants. Sometimes all three were there at the same moment, sometimes Ransford was half an hour late. The one member who was always there to the moment was Dick Bewery, who fortified himself sedulously after his morning's school labours. On this particular day all three met in the dining room at once and sat down together. And before Dick had eaten many mouthfuls of a cold pie to which he had just liberally helped himself, he bent confidentially across the table towards his guardian. "There's something I think you ought to be told about, sir," he remarked with a side glance at Mary. "Something I heard this morning at school. You know, we've a lot of fellows, town boys, who talk." "I dare say," responded Ransford dryly. "Following the example of their mothers, no doubt. Well, what is it?" He too glanced at Mary, and the girl had her work set to look unconscious. "It's this," replied Dick, lowering his voice in spite of the fact that all three were alone. "They're saying in the town that you know something which you won't tell about that affair last week. It's been talked of." Ransford laughed, a little cynically. "Are you quite sure, my boy, that they aren't saying that I daren't tell?" he asked. "Daren't is a much more likely word than won't, I think." "Well, about that, sir," acknowledged Dick. "Comes to that, anyhow." "And what are their grounds?" inquired Ransford. "You've heard them, I'll be bound." "They say that man, Braden, had been here to the house, that morning, not long before he was found dead," answered Dick. "Of course, I said that it was all bosh. I said that if he'd been here and seen you, I'd have heard of it. Dead certain." "That's not quite so dead certain, Dick, as that I have no knowledge of his ever having been here," said Ransford. "But who said he came here?" "Mrs. Deramore," replied Dick promptly. "She says she saw him go away from the house and across the close, a little before 10. So Jim Deramore says, anyway, and he says his mother's eyes are as good as another's." "Doubtless," assented Ransford. He looked at Mary again and saw that she was keeping hers fixed on her plate. "Well," he continued, "if it will give you any satisfaction, Dick, you can tell the gossips that Dr. Ransford never saw any man, Braden or anybody else, at his house that morning, and that he never exchanged a word with Braden. So much for that. But," he added, "you needn't expect them to believe you. I know these people. If they've got an idea into their heads, they'll ride it to death. Nevertheless, what I say is a fact." Dick presently went off, and once more Ransford looked at Mary, and this time Mary had to meet her guardian's inquiring glance. "Have you heard anything of this?" he asked. "That there was a rumour, yes," she replied without hesitation. "But not until just now, this morning." "Who told you of it?" inquired Ransford. Mary hesitated. Then she remembered that Mr. Folliot, at any rate, had not bound her to secrecy. "Mr. Folliot," she replied. "He called me into his garden to give me those roses, and he mentioned that Mrs. Deramore had said these things to Mrs. Folliot, and he seemed to think it highly probable that Mrs. Folliot would repeat them. He told me because he didn't want you to think that the rumour had originally arisen at his house." "Very good of him, I'm sure," remarked Ransford dryly. "They all like to shift the blame from one to another. But," he added, looking searchingly at her, "you don't know anything about Braden's having come here?" He saw at once that she did, and Mary saw a slight shade of anxiety come over his face. "Yes, I do," she replied. "That morning. But it was told to me only today, in strict confidence." "In strict confidence?" he repeated. "May I know by whom?" "Dr. Bryce," she answered. "I met him this morning. And I think you ought to know. Only it was in confidence." She paused for a moment, looking at him, and her face grew troubled. "I hate to suggest it," she continued, "but will you come with me to see him, and I'll ask him, things being as they are, to tell you what he told me? I can't without his permission." Ransford shook his head and frowned. "I dislike it," he said. It's putting ourselves in his power, as it were. But I'm not going to be left in the dark. Put on your hat, then." Bryce, ever since his coming to Wrychester, had occupied rooms in an old house in Friary Lane, at the back of the Close. He was comfortably lodged. Downstairs he had a double sitting room extending from the front to the back of the house. His front window looked out on one garden, his back window on another. He had just finished lunch in the front part of his room, and was looking out of his window, wondering what to do with himself that afternoon, when he saw Ransford and Mary Bewery approaching. He guessed the reason of their visit at once, and went straight to the front door to meet them, and without a word mentioned them to follow him into his own quarters. It was characteristic of him that he took the first word, before either of his visitors could speak. "I know why you've come," he said, as he closed the door and glanced at Mary. "You either want my permission that you should tell Dr. Ransford what I told you this morning, or you want me to tell him myself. Am I right?" "I should be glad if you would tell him," replied Mary. "The rumour you spoke of has reached him. He ought to know what you can tell. I have respected your confidence, so far." The two men looked at each other, and this time it was Ransford who spoke first. "It seems to me," he said, "that there is no great reason for privacy. If rumours are flying about in Wrychester, there is an end of privacy. Dick tells me they are saying at the school that it is known that Braden called on me at my house shortly before he was found dead. I know nothing whatever of any such call. But I left you in my surgery that morning. Do you know if he came there?" "Yes," answered Bryce. "He did come. Soon after you'd gone out." "Why did you keep that a secret?" demanded Ransford. "You could have told it to the police, or to the coroner, or to me. Why didn't you?" Before Bryce could answer, all three heard a sharp click of the front garden gate, and looking round, saw Michigan coming up the walk. "Here's one of the police now," said Bryce calmly. "Probably come to extract information. I would much rather he didn't see you here. But I'd also like you to hear what I shall say to him. Step inside there," he continued, drawing aside the curtains which shut off the back room. "Don't stick at trifles. You don't know what may be afoot." He almost forced them away. drew the curtains again, and hurrying to the front door, returned almost immediately with Mitchington. "Hope I'm not disturbing you, doctor," said the inspector as Bryce brought him in and again closed the door. "Not? All right, then. I came round to ask you a question. There's a queer rumour getting out in the town about that affair last week. Seems to have sprung from some of those old dowagers in the Close." "Of course," said Bryce. He was mixing a whisky and soda for his caller, and his laugh mingled with the splash of the siphon. "Of course, I've heard it." "You've heard?" remarked Mitchington. Good health, sir. Heard, of course, that Braden called on Dr. Ransford not long before the accident, or murder, or whatever it was, happened," said Bryce. "That's it, eh?" "Something of that sort," agreed Mitchington. "It's being said, anyway, that Braden was at Ransford's house, and presumably saw him, and that Ransford, accordingly, knows something about him which he hasn't told. Now, what do you know? Do you know if Ransford and Braden did meet that morning?" "Not at Ransford's house, anyway," answered Bryce promptly. "I can prove that. But since this rumour has got out, I'll tell you what I do know, and what the truth is. Braden did come to Ransford's not to the house, but to the surgery. He didn't see Ransford Ransford had gone out, across the Close. Braden saw me." "Bless me! I didn't know that," remarked Mitchington. "You never mentioned it." "You'll not wonder that I didn't," said Bryce, laughing lightly, "when I told you what the man wanted." "What did he want, then?" asked Mitchington. "Merely to be told where the cathedral library was," answered Bryce. Ransford, watching Mary Bewery, saw her cheeks flush, and knew that Bryce was cheerfully telling lies. But Mitchington evidently had no suspicion. "That's all?" he said. "Just a question?" "Just a question that question," replied Bryce. "I pointed out the library, and he walked away. I never saw him again until I was fetched to him dead. And I thought so little of the matter that well, it never even occurred to me to mention it." "Then, though he did call, he never saw Ransford?" asked the inspector. "I tell you Ransford was already gone out," answered Bryce. "He saw no one but myself. Where Mrs. Darramore made her mistake I happen to know, Mitchington, that she started this rumour was in trying to make 2 and 2 into 5. She saw this man crossing the Close as if from Ransford's house, and she at once imagined he'd seen and been talking with Ransford." "Old fool!" said Mitchington. "Of course! That's how these tales get about. However, there's more than that in the air." The two listeners behind the curtains glanced at each other. Ransford's glance showed that he was already chafing at the unpleasantness of his position, but Mary's only betokened apprehension. And suddenly, as if she feared that Ransford would throw the curtains aside and walk into the front room, she laid a hand on his arm and motioned him to be patient and silent. "Oh?" said Bryce. "More in the air? About that business?" "Just so," assented Mitchington. "To start with, the man Varner, the mason, has never ceased talking. They say he's always at it, to the effect that the verdict of the jury at the inquest was all wrong, and that the evidence was put clean aside. He persists that he did see what he swore he saw." "He'll persist in that to his dying day," said Bryce carelessly. "If that's all there is " "It isn't," interrupted the inspector. "Not by a long chalk. But Varner's is a direct affirmation, the other matter's a sort of ugly hint. There's a man named Collishaw, a townsman, who's been employed as a mason's labourer about the cathedral of late. This Collishaw, it seems, was at work somewhere up in the galleries, ambulatories, or whatever they call those upper regions, on the very morning of the affair. And the other night, being somewhat under the influence of drink, and talking the matter over with his mates at a tavern, he let out some dark hints that he could tell something if he liked. Of course, he was pressed to tell them, and wouldn't. Then, so my informant tells me, he was dared to tell, and became surlily silent. That, of course, spread, and got to my ears. I've seen Collishaw." "Well?" asked Bryce. "I believe the man does know something," answered Mitchington. "That's the impression I carried away, anyhow. But he won't speak. I charged him straight away with knowing something, but it was no good. I told him of what I'd heard. All he would say was that whatever he might have said when he'd got a glass of beer or so too much, he wasn't going to say anything now, neither for me nor for anybody." "Just so," remarked Bryce. "But he'll be getting a glass too much again some day, and then perhaps he'll add to what he said before. And you'll be sure to hear of it." "I'm not certain of that," answered Mitchington. "I made some inquiry, and I find that Collishaw is usually a very sober and retiring sort of chap. He'd been lured into drink when he let out what he did. Besides, whether I'm right or wrong, I got the idea into my head that he'd already been squared." "Squared?" exclaimed Bryce. "Why, then, if that affair was really murder, he'd be liable to being charged as an accessory after the fact." "I warned him of that," replied Mitchington. "Yes, I warned him solemnly." "With no effect?" asked Bryce. "He's a surly sort of man," said Mitchington. "The sort that takes refuge in silence. He made no answer beyond a growl." "Do you really think he knows something?" suggested Bryce. "Well, if there is anything, it'll come out in time." "Oh, it'll come out," assented Mitchington. "I'm by no means satisfied with that verdict of the coroner's inquiry. I believe there was foul play, of some sort. I'm still following things up, quietly. And I'll tell you something between ourselves I've made an important discovery. It's this on the evening of Braden's arrival at the Mitre, he was out, somewhere, for a whole 2 hours, by himself." "I thought we learned from Mrs. Partingley that he and the other man, Dellingham, spent the evening together," said Bryce. "So we did. But that was not quite so," replied Mitchington. "Braden went out of the Mitre just before 9 o'clock, and he didn't return until a few minutes after 11. Now then, where did he go?" "I suppose you're trying to find that out?" asked Bryce, after a pause, during which the listeners heard the caller rise and make for the door. "Of course!" replied Mitchington with a confident laugh. "And I shall. Keep it to yourself, Doctor." When Bryce had let the inspector out, and returned to his sitting room, Ransford and Mary had come from behind the curtains. He looked at them and shook his head. "You heard a good deal, you see," he observed. "Look here!" said Ransford peremptorily. "You put that man off about the call at my surgery. You didn't tell him the truth." "Quite right," assented Bryce. "I didn't. Why should I?" "What did Braden ask you?" demanded Ransford. "Come, now!" "Merely if Dr. Ransford was in," answered Bryce, remarking that he had once known a Dr. Ransford. "That was literally all. I replied that you were not in." Ransford stood silently thinking for a moment or two. Then he moved towards the door. "I don't see that any good will come of more talk about this," he said. "We three, at any rate, know this I never saw Braden when he came to my house." Then he motioned Mary to follow him, and they went away, and Bryce, having watched them out of sight, smiled at himself in his mirror with full satisfaction. End of chapter 11. Recorded by Gesine in January 2007.
Chapter 12 of the Paradise Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Kristen Hughes. The Paradise Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 12. Murder of the Mason's Labourer. It was towards noon of the very next day that Bryce made a forward step in the matter of solving the problem of Richard Jenkins and his tomb in Paradise. Ever since his return from Barthorpe, he had been making attempts to get at the true meaning of this mystery. He had paid so many visits to the cathedral library that Ambrose Campany had asked him jestingly if he was going in for archaeology. Bryce had replied that having nothing to do just then, he saw no reason why he shouldn't improve his knowledge of the antiques of Wrychester. But he was scrupulously careful not to let the librarian know the real object of his prying and peeping into the old books and documents. Campany, as Bryce was very well aware, was a walking encyclopedia of information about Wrychester Cathedral. He was, in fact, at that time engaged in completing a history of it, and it was through that history that Bryce accidentally got his precious information. For on the day following the interview with Mary Bewery and Ransford, Bryce, being in the library, was treated by Campany to an inspection of certain drawings which the librarian had made for illustrating his work drawings, most of them of old brasses, coats of arms, and the like. And at the foot of one of these, a drawing of a shield on which was sculptured 3 crows. Bryce saw the name Richard Jenkins, armiger. It was all he could do to repress a start and to check his tongue. But Campany, knowing nothing, quickly gave him the information he wanted. "All these drawings," he said, "are of old things in and about the cathedral. Some of them, like that, for instance, that Jenkins shield, are of ornamentations on tombs which are so old that the inscriptions have completely disappeared, tombs in the cloisters and in Paradise. Some of those tombs can only be identified by these sculptures and ornaments." "How do you know, for instance, that any particular tomb or monument is, we'll say, Jenkins's?" asked Bryce, feeling that he was on safe ground. "Must be a matter of doubt if there's no inscription left, isn't it?" "No," replied Campany, "no doubt at all. In that particular case, there's no doubt that a certain tomb out there on the corner of Paradise, near the east wall of the south porch, is that of one Richard Jenkins, because it bears his coat of arms, which, as you see, bore these birds, intended either as crows or ravens. The inscription's clean gone from that tomb, which is why it isn't particularized in that chart of burials in Paradise. The man who prepares that chart didn't know how to trace things as we do nowadays. Richard Jenkins was, as you may guess, a Welshman who settled here in Wrychester in the 17th century. He left some money to St. Hedwige's Church, outside the walls, but he was buried here. There are more instances. Look at this now, this coat of arms. That's the only means there is of identifying another tomb in Paradise, that of Jervis Tyrrwhit. You see his armorial bearings in this drawing? Now those—" Bryce let the librarian go on talking and explaining, and heard all he had to say as a man hears things in a dream. What was really active in his own mind was joy at this unexpected stroke of luck. He himself might have searched for many a year and never found the last resting-place of Richard Jenkins. And when, soon after the great clock of the cathedral had struck the hour of noon, he left Campany and quitted the library, he walked over to Paradise and plunged in amongst its yews and cypresses, intent on seeing the Jenkins tomb for himself. No one could suspect anything from merely seeing him there, and all he wanted was one glance at the ancient monument. But Bryce was not to give even one look at Richard Jenkins's tomb that day, nor the next, nor for many days. Death met him in another form before he had taken many steps in the quiet enclosure where so much of Wrychester mortality lay sleeping. From over the topmost branches of the old yew trees a great shaft of noontide sun fell full on a patch of the grey walls of the high-roofed nave. At the foot of it, his back comfortably planted against the angle of a projecting buttress, sat a man, evidently fast asleep in the warmth of those powerful rays. His head leaned down and forward over his chest. His hands were folded across his waist. His whole attitude was that of a man who, having eaten and drunken in the open air, has dropped off to sleep. That he had so dropped off while in the very act of smoking was evident from the presence of a short, well-blackened clay pipe, which had fallen from his lips and lay in the grass beside him. Near the pipe, spread on a coloured handkerchief, were the remains of his dinner. Bryce's quick eye noticed fragments of bread, cheese, onions. And close by stood one of those tin bottles in which labouring men carry their drink. Its cork, tied to the neck by a piece of string, dangled against the side. A few yards away, a mass of fallen rubbish and a shovel and wheelbarrow showed at what the sleeper had been working when his dinner hour and time for rest had arrived. Something unusual, something curiously noticeable, yet he could not exactly tell what, made Bryce go closer to the sleeping man. There was a strange stillness about him, a rigidity which seemed to suggest something more than sleep. And suddenly, with a stifled exclamation, he bent forward and lifted one of the folded hands. It dropped like a leaden weight when Bryce released it, and he pushed back the man's face and looked searchingly into it. And in that instant he knew that for the second time within a fortnight he had found a dead man in Wrychester Paradise. There was no doubt whatever that the man was dead. His hands and body were warm enough, but there was not a flicker of breath. He was as dead as any of the folk who lay 6 feet beneath the old gravestones around him. And Bryce's practised touch and eye knew that he was only just dead, and that he had died in his sleep. Everything there pointed unmistakably to what had happened. The man had eaten his frugal dinner, washed it down from his tin bottle, lighted his pipe, leaned back in the warm sunlight, dropped asleep, and died as quietly as a child taken from its play to its slumbers. After one more careful look, Bryce turned and made through the trees to the path which crossed the old graveyard. And there, going leisurely home to lunch, was Dick Bewery, who glanced at the young doctor inquisitively. "Hullo!" he exclaimed, with the freedom of youth towards something not much older. "You there! Anything on?" Then he looked more clearly, seeing Bryce to be pale and excited. Bryce laid a hand on the lad's arm. "Look here," he said. "There's something wrong again, in here. Run down to the police station. Get hold of Mitchington, quietly, you understand. Bring him here at once. If he's not there, bring somebody else, any of the police. But say nothing to any of them." Dick gave him another swift look, turned, and ran. And Bryce went back to the dead man and picked up the tin bottle, and making a cup of his left hand, poured out a trickle of the contents. Cold tea, and as far as he could judge, nothing else. He put the tip of his little finger into the weak-looking stuff and tasted. It tasted of nothing but a superabundance of sugar. He stood there, watching the dead man, until the sound of footsteps behind him gave warning of the return of Dick Bewery, who, in another minute, hurried through the bushes, followed by Mitchington. The boy stared in silence at the still figure, but the inspector, after a hasty glance, turned a horrified face on Bryce. "Good Lord!" he gasped. "It's Collishaw!" Bryce, for the moment, failed to comprehend this, and Mitchington shook his head. "Collishaw!" he repeated. "Collishaw, you know! The man I told you about yesterday afternoon! The man that said—" Mitchington suddenly checked himself, with a glance at Dick Bewery. "I remember now," said Bryce. "The mason's labourer." "So this is the man, eh? Well, Mitchington, he's dead. I found him dead just now. I should say he'd been dead 5 to 10 minutes, not more. You'd better get help, and I'd like another medical man to see him before he's removed." Mitchington looked again at Dick. "Perhaps you'd fetch Dr. Ransford, Mr. Richard?" he asked. "He's nearest." "Dr. Ransford's not at home," said Dick. "He went to Highminster, some county council business or other, at 10 this morning, and he won't be back until 4. I happen to know that. Shall I run for Dr. Coates?" "If you wouldn't mind," said Mitchington. "And as it's close by, Drop in at the station again and tell the sergeant to come here with a couple of men. I say," he went on when the boy had hurried off, "this is a queer business, Dr. Bryce. What do you think?" "I think this," answered Bryce. "That man, look at him, a strong, healthy-looking fellow in the very prime of life. That man has met his death by foul means. You take particular care of those dinner things of his, the remains of his dinner, every scrap, and of that tin bottle. That especially. Take all these things yourself, Mitchington, and lock them up. They'll be wanted for examination." Mitchington glanced at the simple matters which Bryce indicated, and suddenly he turned a half-frightened glance on his companion. "You don't mean to say that you suspect he's been poisoned?" he asked. "Good Lord, if that is so—" "I don't think you'll find that there's much doubt about it," answered Bryce. "But that's a point that will soon be settled. You'd better tell the coroner at once, Mitchington, and he'll issue a formal order to Dr. Coates to make a post-mortem. And," he added significantly, "I shall be surprised if it isn't, as I say, poison." "If that's so," observed Mitchington, with a grim shake of his head, "if that really is so, then I know what I shall think. This," he went on, pointing to the dead man, "this is a sort of sequel to the other affair. There's been something in what the poor chap said. He did know something against somebody, and that somebody's got to hear of it, and silenced him. But, Lord, doctor, how can it have been done?" "I can see how it can have been done, easy enough," said Bryce. "This man has evidently been at work here by himself all the morning. He, of course, brought his dinner with him. He no doubt put his basket and his bottle down somewhere while he did his work. What easier than for someone to approach through these trees and shrubs while the man's back was turned, or he was busy round one of these corners, and put some deadly poison into that bottle? Nothing." "Well," remarked Mitchington, "if that's so, it proves something else, to my mind." "What?" asked Bryce. "Why, that whoever it was who did it was somebody who had a knowledge of poison," answered Mitchington. "And I should say there aren't many people in Wrychester who have such knowledge outside yourselves and the chemists. It's a black business, this." Bryce nodded silently. He waited until Dr. Coates, an elderly man who was the leading practitioner in the town, arrived, and to him he gave a careful account of his discovery. And after the police had taken the body away, and he had accompanied Mitchington to the police station and seen the tin bottle and the remains of Collishaw's dinner safely locked up, he went home to lunch, and to wonder at this strange development. The inspector was doubtless right in saying that Collishaw had been done to death by someone who wanted to silence him, but who could that somebody be? Bryce's thoughts immediately turned to the fact that Ransford had overheard all that Mitchington had said, and in that very room in which he, Bryce, was then lunching. Ransford! Was it possible that Ransford had realized a danger in Collishaw's knowledge and had... He was interrupted at this stage by Mitchington, who came hurriedly in with a scared face. I say," he whispered as soon as Bryce's landlady had shut the door on them. "Here's a fine business. I've heard something I can hardly credit, but it's true. I've been to tell Collishaw's family what's happened, and I'm fairly dazed by it. It is so." "What's so?" demanded Bryce. "What is it that's true?" Mitchington bent closer over the table. "Dr. Ransford was fetched to Collishaw's cottage at 6 o'clock this morning," he said. "It seems that Collishaw's wife had been in a poor way about her health of late, and Dr. Ransford has attended her, on and off. She had some sort of a seizure this morning, early, and Ransford was sent for. He was there some little time, and I've heard some queer things." "What sort of queer things?" demanded Bryce. "Don't be afraid of speaking out, man. There's no one to hear but myself." "Well, things that look suspicious on the face of it," continued Mitchington, who was obviously much upset, "as you'll acknowledge when you hear them. I got my information from the next-door neighbour, Mrs. Batts. Mrs. Batts says that when Ransford, who'd been fetched by Mrs. Batts's eldest lad, came to Collishaw's house, Collishaw was putting up his dinner to take to work." "What on earth made Mrs. Batts tell you that?" interrupted Bryce. "Oh, well, to tell you the truth, I put a few questions to her as to what went on while Ransford was in the house," answered Mitchington. "When I once found out that he had been there, you know, I naturally wanted to know all I could." "Well?" asked Bryce. "Collishaw, I say, was putting up his dinner to take to his work," continued Mitchington. "Mrs. Batts was doing a thing or two about the house. Ransford went upstairs to see Mrs. Collishaw. After a while he came down and said he would have to remain a little. Collishaw went up to speak to his wife before going out. And then Ransford asked Mrs. Batts for something, I forget what, some small matter which the Collishaws hadn't got, and she had, and she went next door to fetch it. Therefore, do you see? Ransford was left alone with Collishaw's tin bottle." Bryce, who had been listening attentively, looked steadily at the inspector. "You're suspecting Ransford already?" he said. Mitchington shook his head. "What's it look like?" he answered almost appealingly. "I put it to you now, what does it look like? Here's this man been poisoned without a doubt, I'm certain of it. And there was those rumours. It's idle to deny that they centred in Ransford. And this morning Ransford had the chance." "That's arguing that Ransford purposely carried a dose of poison to put into Collishaw's tin bottle," said Bryce half sneeringly. "Not very probable, you know, Mitchington." Mitchington spread out his hands. "Well, there it is," he said. "As I say, there's no denying the suspicious look of it. If I were only certain that those rumours about what Collishaw hinted he could say had got to Ransford's ears, why then—" "What's being done about that post-mortem?" asked Bryce. "Dr. Coates and Dr. Everest are going to do it this afternoon," replied Mitchington. "The coroner went to them at once, as soon as I told him." "They'll probably have to call in an expert from London," said Bryce. "However, you can't do anything definite, you know, until the result's known. Don't say anything of this to anybody. I'll drop in at your place later and hear if Coates can say anything really certain." Mitchington went away, and Bryce spent the rest of the afternoon wondering, speculating and scheming. If Ransford had really got rid of this man who knew something, why then it was certainly Ransford who killed Braden. He went round to the police station at 5 o'clock. Mitchington drew him aside. "Coates said there's no doubt about it," he whispered. "Poisoned. Hydrocyanic acid." End of chapter 12.
Chapter 13 of The Paradise Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Gesine. The Paradise Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 13. Bryce is asked a question. Mitchington stepped aside into a private room, motioning Bryce to follow him. He carefully closed the door and, looking significantly at his companion, repeated his last words with a shake of the head. "Poisoned, without the very least doubt," he whispered. "Hydrocyanic acid, which I understand is the same thing as what's commonly called prussic acid. They say they hadn't the least difficulty in finding that out. So there you are." "That's what Coates has told you, of course?" asked Bryce. "After the autopsy?" "Both of 'em told me, Coates and Everest, who helped him," replied Mitchington. "They said it was obvious from the very start. And I say " "Well?" said Bryce. "It wasn't in that tin bottle, anyway," remarked Mitchington, who was evidently greatly weighted with mystery. "No, of course it wasn't," affirmed Bryce. "Good heavens, man, I know that." "How do you know?" asked Mitchington. Because I poured a few drops from that bottle into my hand when I first found Collishaw and tasted the stuff, answered Bryce readily. Cold tea, with too much sugar in it. There was no HCN in that, besides, wherever it is, there's always a smell stronger or fainter of bitter almonds. There was none about that bottle. Yet you were very anxious that we should take care of the bottle, observed Mitchington. Of course, because I suspected the use of some much rarer poison than that, retorted Bryce. Pooh, it's a clumsy way of poisoning anybody, quick though it is. Well, there's where it is, said Mitchington. That'll be the medical evidence at the inquest, anyway. That's how it was done. And the question now is who did it? Interrupted Bryce. Precisely. Well, I'll say this much at once, Mitchington. Whoever did it was either a big bungler or damned clever. That's what I say. I don't understand you, said Mitchington. Plain enough, my meaning, replied Bryce, smiling. To finish anybody with that stuff is easy enough, but no poison is more easily detected. It's an amateurish way of poisoning anybody, unless you can do it in such a fashion that no suspicion can attach you to. And in this case, it's here. Whoever administered that poison to Collishaw must have been certain, absolutely certain, mind you, that it was impossible for anyone to find out that he'd done so. Therefore, I'd say what I said. The man must be damned clever. Otherwise, he'd be found out pretty quick. And all that puzzles me is how was it administered? How much would kill anybody pretty quick? Asked Mitchington. How much? 1 drop would cause instantaneous death, answered Bryce. Cause paralysis of the heart there and then, instantly. Mitchington remained silent a while, looking meditatively at Bryce. Then he turned to a locked drawer, produced a key, and took something out of the drawer, a small object wrapped in paper. I'm telling you a good deal, Doctor, he said, but as you know so much already, I'll tell you a bit more. Look at this. He opened his hand and showed Bryce a small cardboard pill-box, across the face of which a few words were written. 1 after meals, Mr. Collishaw. Whose handwriting's that? Demanded Mitchington. Bryce looked closer and started. Ransford's, he muttered. Ransford, of course. That box was in Collishaw's waistcoat pocket, said Mitchington. There are pills inside it now. See. He took off the lid of the box and revealed 4 sugar-coated pills. It wouldn't hold more than 6, this, he observed. Bryce extracted a pill and put his nose to it after scratching a little of the sugar coating away. Mere digestive pills, he announced. Could it have been given in one of these? Asked Mitchington. Possible, replied Bryce. He stood thinking for a moment. Have you shown those things to Coates and Everest? He asked at last. Not yet, replied Mitchington. I wanted to find out first if Ransford gave this box to Collishaw and when. I'm going to Collishaw's house presently. I've certain inquiries to make. His widow'll know about these pills. You're suspecting Ransford, said Bryce. That's certain. Mitchington carefully put away the pill box and relocked the drawer. I've got some decidedly uncomfortable ideas, which I'd much rather not have, about Dr. Ransford, he said. When one thing seems to fit into another, what is one to think? If I were certain that that rumour which spread about Collishaw's knowledge of something, had got to Ransford's ears, why, I should say it looked very much as if Ransford wanted to stop Collishaw's tongue for good before it could say more, and next time, perhaps, something definite. If men once begin to hint that they know something, they don't stop at hinting. Collishaw might have spoken plainly before long. To us. Bryce asked a question about the holding of the inquest and went away. After thinking things over, he turned in the direction of the cathedral and made his way through the cloisters to the close. He was going to make another move in his own game. while there was a good chance. Everything at this juncture was throwing excellent cards into his hand. He would be foolish, he thought, not to play them to advantage. And so he made straight for Ransford's house, and before he reached it, met Ransford and Mary Bewery, who were crossing the close from another point, on their way from the railway station, whither Mary had gone especially to meet her guardian. They were in such deep conversation that Bryce was close upon them before they observed his presence. When Ransford saw his late assistant, he scowled unconsciously. Bryce, and the interview of the previous afternoon, had been much in his thoughts all day, and he had an uneasy feeling that Bryce was playing some game. Bryce was quick to see that scowl, and to observe the sudden start which Mary could not repress, and he was just as quick to speak. "I was going to your house, Dr. Ransford," he remarked quietly. "I don't want to force my presence on you, now or at any time, but I think you'd better give me a few minutes." They were at Ransford's garden gate by that time, and Ransford flung it open and motioned Bryce to follow. He led the way into the dining room, closed the door on the three, and looked at Bryce. Bryce took the glance as a question, and put another in words. "You've heard of what's happened during the day?" he said. "About Collishaw, yes," answered Ransford. "Miss Bewery has just told me what her brother told her." "What of it?" "I have just come from the police station," said Bryce. "Coates and Everest have carried out an autopsy this afternoon. Mitchington told me the result." "Well?" demanded Ransford, with no attempt to conceal his impatience. "And what then?" "Collishaw was poisoned," replied Bryce, watching Ransford with a closeness which Mary did not fail to observe. "HCN. No doubt at all about it." "Well, and what then?" asked Ransford, still more impatiently. "To be explicit, what's all this to do with me?" "I came here to do you a service," answered Bryce. "Whether you like to take it or not is your lookout. You may as well know it you're in danger. Collishaw is the man who hinted, as you heard yesterday in my rooms, that he could say something definite about the Braden affair if he liked." "Well?" said Ransford. "It's known to the police that you were at Collishaw's house early this morning," said Bryce. "Mitchington knows it." Ransford laughed. "Does Mitchington know that I overheard what he said to you yesterday afternoon?" he inquired. "No, he doesn't," answered Bryce. "He couldn't possibly know unless I told him. I haven't told him I'm not going to tell him. But he's suspicious already." "Of me, of course," suggested Ransford, with another laugh. He took a turn across the room and suddenly faced round on Bryce, who had remained standing near the door. "Do you really mean to tell me that Mitchington is such a fool as to believe that I would poison a poor working man, and in that clumsy fashion?" he burst out. "Of course you don't!" "I never said I did," answered Bryce. "I'm only telling you what Mitchington thinks his ground for suspecting. He confided in me because well, it was I who found Collishaw. Mitchington is in possession of a box of digestive pills, which you evidently gave Collishaw." "Bah!" exclaimed Ransford. "The man's a fool! Let him come and talk to me." "He won't do that yet," said Bryce. "But I'm afraid he'll bring all this out at the inquest. The fact is, he's suspicious, what with one thing or another, about the former affair. He thinks you conceal the truth, whatever it may be, as regards any knowledge of Braden which you may or mayn't have." "I'll tell you what it is," said Ransford suddenly. "It just comes to this I'm suspected of having had a hand the hand, if you like in Braden's death, and now of getting rid of Collishaw because Collishaw could prove that I had that hand. That's about it." "A clear way of putting it, certainly," assented Bryce. "But there is a very clear way, too, of dissipating any such ideas." "What way?" demanded Ransford. "If you do know anything about the Braden affair, why not reveal it, and be done with the whole thing?" suggested Bryce. That would finish matters. Ransford took a long, silent look at his questioner, and Bryce looked steadily back, and Mary Bewery anxiously watched both men. "That's my business," said Ransford at last. "I'm neither to be coerced, bullied, or cajoled. I'm obliged to you for giving me a hint of my danger, I suppose, and I don't propose to say any more." "Neither do I," said Bryce. "I only came to tell you." And therewith, having successfully done all that he wanted to do, he walked out of the room and the house, and Ransford, standing in the window, his hands thrust in his pockets, watched him go away across the close. "Guardian!" said Mary softly. Ransford turned sharply. "Wouldn't it be best," she continued, speaking nervously, if you do know anything about that unfortunate man, if you told it? Why have this suspicion fastening itself on you? You!" Ransford made an effort to calm himself. He was furiously angry, angry with Bryce, angry with Mitchington, angry with a cloud of foolishness and stupidity that seemed to be gathering. "Why should I? Supposing that I do know something, which I don't admit, why should I allow myself to be coerced and frightened by these fools?" he asked. "No man can prevent suspicion falling on him. It's my bad luck in this instance. Why should I rush to the police station and say, 'Here, I'll blurt out all I know, everything'? Why?" "Wouldn't that be better than knowing that people are saying things?" she asked. "As to that," replied Ransford, "you can't prevent people saying things, especially in a town like this. If it hadn't been for the unfortunate fact that Braden came to the surgery door, nothing would have been said. But what of that? I have known hundreds of men in my time, aye, and forgotten them. No, I am not going to fall a victim to this device. It all springs out of curiosity. As to this last affair, it's all nonsense." "But if the man was really poisoned?" suggested Mary. "Let the police find the poisoner," said Ransford, with a grim smile. "That's their job." Mary said nothing for a moment, and Ransford moved restlessly about the room. "I don't trust that fellow Bryce," he said suddenly. "He's up to something. I don't forget what he said when I bundled him out that morning." "What?" she asked. "That he would be a bad enemy," answered Ransford. "He's posing now as a friend, but a man's never to be so much suspected as when he comes doing what you may call unnecessary acts of friendship. I'd rather that anybody was mixed up in my affairs, your affairs, than Pemberton Bryce." "So would I," she said. "But " she paused there a moment and then looked appealingly at Ransford. "I do wish you'd tell me what you promised to tell me," she said. "You know what I mean about me and Dick. Somehow I don't quite know how or why I've an uneasy feeling that Bryce knows something, and that he's mixing it all up with this. Why not tell me, please?" Ransford, who was still marching about the room, came to a halt, and leaning his hands on the table between them, looked earnestly at her. "Don't ask me that now," he said. "I can't yet. The fact is, I'm waiting for something some particulars. As soon as I get them, I'll speak to you and to Dick. In the meantime, don't ask me again, and don't be afraid. And as to this affair, leave it to me. And if you meet Bryce again, refuse to discuss anything with him. Look here, there's only one reason why he professes friendliness and a desire to save me annoyance. He thinks he can ingratiate himself with you." "Mistaken," murmured Mary, shaking her head. "I don't trust him. And less than ever because of yesterday. Would an honest man have done what he did? Let that police inspector talk freely, as he did, with people concealed behind a curtain? And he laughed about it! I hated myself for being there, yet could we help it? "I'm not going to hate myself on Pemberton Bryce's account," said Ransford. "Let him play his game that he has one, I'm certain." Bryce had gone away to continue his game, or another line of it. The Collishaw matter had not made him forget, the Richard Jenkins tomb, and now, after leaving Ransford's house, he crossed the close to Paradise with the object of doing a little more investigation. But at the archway of the ancient enclosure he met old Simpson Harker, pottering about in his usual apparently aimless fashion. Harker smiled at sight of Bryce. "Ah, I was wanting to have a word with you, Doctor," he said. "Something important. Have you got a minute or two to spare, sir? Come round to my little place, then. We shall be quiet there." Bryce had any amount of time to spare for an interesting person like Harker, and he followed the old man to his house, a tiny place set in a nest of similar old-world buildings behind the close. Harker led him into a little parlour, comfortable and snug, wherein were several shelves of books, of a curiously legal and professional-looking aspect, some old pictures, and a cabinet of odds and ends, stowed away in a dark corner. The old man motioned him to an easy-chair, and going over to a cupboard, produced a decanter of whisky and a box of cigars. "We can have a peaceful and comfortable talk here, Doctor," he remarked, as he sat down near Bryce, after fetching glasses and soda water. "I live all alone, like a hermit. My bit of work's done by a woman who looks in of a morning. So we're all here by ourselves. Light your cigar. Same as that I gave you at Barthorpe. Well now," he continued, as Bryce settled down to listen. "There's a question I want to put to you, strictly between ourselves. Strictest of confidence, you know. It was you who was called to Braden by Varner, and you were left alone with Braden's body?" "Well," admitted Bryce, suddenly growing suspicious. "What of it?" Harker edged his chair a little closer to his guest's and leaned towards him. "What?" he asked in a whisper. "What have you done with that scrap of paper that you took out of Braden's purse?" End of chapter 13. Recorded by Gesine in January 2007.
Of The Paradise Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anita Roy Dobbs, Boston, January 2007. The Paradise Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 14. From the Past. If any remarkably keen and able observer of the odd characteristics of humanity had been present in Harker's little parlour at that moment, watching him and his visitor, he would have been struck by what happened when the old man put this sudden and point-blank question to the young one. For Harker put the question, though in a whisper, in no more than a casual, almost friendly, confidential way, and Bryce never showed by the start of a finger or the flicker of an eyelash that he felt it to be what he really knew it to be, the most surprising and startling question he had ever had put to him. Instead, he looked his questioner calmly in the eyes and put a question in his turn. "Who are you, Mr. Harker?" asked Bryce quietly. Harker laughed, almost gleefully. "Yes, you've a right to ask that," he said. "Of course. Glad you take it that way. You'll do." "I'll qualify it then," added Bryce. "It's not who, it's what are you?" Harker waved his cigar at the bookshelves in front of which his visitor sat. "Take a look at my collection of literature, Doctor," he said. "What do you think of it?" Bryce turned and leisurely inspected one shelf after another. "Seems to consist of little else but criminal cases and legal handbooks," he remarked quietly. "I begin to suspect you, Mr. Harker. They say here in Wrychester that you're a retired tradesman. I think you're a retired policeman of the detective branch." Harker laughed again. "No Wrychester man has ever crossed my threshold since I came to settle down here," he said. "You're the first person I've ever asked in, with one notable exception. I've never even had Campany, the librarian, here. I'm a hermit." "But you were a detective," suggested Bryce. "Aye, for a good 25 years," replied Harker. "And pretty well known, too, sir. But my question, doctor, all between ourselves." "I'll ask you one, then," said Bryce. "How do you know I took a scrap of paper from Braden's purse?" "Because I know that he had such a paper in his purse the night he came to the Mitre," answered Harker, "and was certain to have it there next morning, and because I also know that you were left alone with the body for some minutes after Varner fetched you to it, and that when Braden's clothing and effects were searched by Mitchington, the paper wasn't there. So of course you took it. Doesn't matter to me that you did, except that I know from knowing that you're on a similar game to my own, which is why you went down to Leicestershire." "You knew Braden?" asked Bryce. "I knew him," answered Harker. "You saw him, spoke with him, here in Wrychester?" suggested Bryce. "He was here, in this room, in that chair, from 9:05 to close on 10 o'clock, the night before his death," replied Harker. Bryce, who was quietly appreciating the Havana cigar which the old man had given him, picked up his glass, took a drink, and settled himself in his easy chair as if he meant to stay there a while. "I think we'd better talk confidentially, Mr. Harker," he said. "Precisely what we are doing, Dr. Bryce," replied Harker. "All right, my friend," said Bryce laconically. "Now we understand each other. So, do you know who John Braden really was?" "Yes," replied Harker promptly. "He was in reality John Brake, ex-bank manager, ex-convict." "Do you know if he has any relatives here in Wrychester?" inquired Bryce. "Yes," said Harker. "The boy and girl who live with Ransford. They're Brake's son and daughter." "Did Brake know that when he came here?" continued Bryce. "No, he didn't. He hadn't the least idea of it," responded Harker. "Had you, then?" asked Bryce. "No, not until later, a little later," replied Harker. "You found it out at Barthorpe?" suggested Bryce. "Not a bit of it. I worked it out here, after Brake was dead," said Harker. "I went to Barthorpe on quite different business Brake's business." "Ah!" said Bryce. He looked the old detective quietly in the eyes. "You'd better tell me all about it," he added. "If we're both going to tell each other all about it," stipulated Harker. "That's settled," assented Bryce. Harker smoked thoughtfully for a moment and seemed to be thinking. "I'd better go back to the beginning," he said. "But first, what do you know about Brake? I know you went down to Barthorpe to find out what you could. How far did your searches take you?" "I know that Brake married a girl from Braden Medworth, that he took her to London, where he was manager of a branch bank, that he got into trouble and was sentenced to 10 years' penal servitude," answered Bryce, "together with some small details into which we needn't go at present." "Well, as long as you know all that, there's a common basis and a common starting point," remarked Harker. "So I'll begin at Brake's trial. It was I who arrested Brake. There was no trouble, no bother. He'd been taken unawares by an inspector of the bank. He'd a considerable deficiency. Couldn't make it good. Couldn't or wouldn't explain, except by half-sullen hints that he'd been cruelly deceived. There was no defense. Couldn't be. His counsel said that he could— "I've read the account of the trial," interrupted Bryce. "All right. Then you know as much as I can tell you on that point," said Harker. "He got, as you say, 10 years. I saw him just before he was removed, and asked him if there was anything I could do for him about his wife and children. I'd never seen them. I arrested him at the bank, and of course he was never out of custody after that. He answered in a queer, curt way that his wife and children were being looked after. I heard, incidentally, that his wife had left home, or was from home. There was something mysterious about it. Either as soon as he was arrested, or before. Anyway, he said nothing, and from that moment I never set eyes on him again until I met him in the street here in Wrychester the other night, when he came to the Mitre. I knew him at once, and he knew me. We met under one of those big standard lamps in the marketplace. I was following my usual practice of having an evening walk last thing before going to bed, and we stopped and stared at each other. Then he came forward with his hand out, and we shook hands. "This is an odd thing," he said. "You're the very man I wanted to find. Come somewhere where it's quiet, and let me have a word with you." So I brought him here. Bryce was all attention now. For once he was devoting all his faculties to tense and absorbed concentration on what another man could tell, leaving reflections and conclusions on what he heard until all had been told. "I brought him here," repeated Harker. "I told him I'd been retired and was living here, as he saw, alone. I asked him no questions about himself. I could see he was a well-dressed, apparently well-to-do man. And presently he began to tell me about himself. He said that after he'd finished his term he left England and for some time travelled in Canada and the United States, and had gone then on to New Zealand and afterwards to Australia, where he'd settled down and begun speculating in wool. I said I hoped he'd done well. Yes, he said, he'd done very nicely. And then he gave me a quiet dig in the ribs. "I'll tell you one thing I've done, Harker," he said. "You were very polite and considerate to me when I'd my trouble, so I don't mind telling you. I paid the bank every penny of that money they lost through my foolishness at that time. Every penny, 4 years ago, with interest, and I've got their receipt." "Delighted to hear it, Mr. Is it the same name still?" I said. "My name ever since I left England," he said, giving me a look, "is Braden, John Braden. Yes," he went on, "I paid 'em, though I never had one penny of the money I was fool enough to take for the time being. Not one halfpenny." "Who had it, Mr. Braden?" I asked him, thinking he'd perhaps tell after all that time. "Never mind, my lad," he answered. "It'll come out yet. Never mind that now. I'll tell you why I wanted to see you. The fact is, I've only been a few hours in England, so to speak, but I'd thought of you and wondered where I could get hold of you. You're the only man of your profession I ever met, you see," he added, with a laugh, "and I want a bit of help in that way." "Well, Mr. Braden," I said, "I've retired, but if it's an easy job—" "It's one you can do, easy enough," he said. "It's just this. I met a man in Australia who's extremely anxious to get some news of another man named Falconer Wraye, who hails from Barthorpe in Leicestershire. I promised to make inquiries for him. Now, I have strong reasons why I don't want to go near Barthorpe. Barthorpe has unpleasant memories and associations for me, and I don't want to be seen there. But this thing's got to be personal investigation. Will you go here for me? I'll make it worth your while. All you've got to do," he went on, "is to go there, see the police authorities, town officials, anybody that knows the place, and ask them if they can tell you anything of one Falconer Wraye, who was at one time a small estate agent in Barthorpe, left the place about 17 years ago, maybe 18, and is believed to have recently gone back to the neighbourhood. That's all. Get what information you can, and write it to me, care of my bankers in London. Give me a sheet of paper and I'll put down particulars for you." Harker paused at this point, and nodded his head at the old bureau which stood in a corner of his room. "The sheet of paper's there," he said. "It's got on it, in his writing, a brief memorandum of what he wanted and the address of his bankers. When he'd given it to me, he put his hand in his pocket and pulled out a purse, in which I could see he was carrying plenty of money. He took out some notes. 'Here's £25 on account, Harker,' he said. 'You might have to spend a bit. Don't be afraid. Plenty more where that comes from. You'll do it soon?' he asked. 'Yes, I'll do it, Mr. Braden,' I answered. It'll be a bit of a holiday for me." "That's all right," he said. "I'm delighted I came across you." "Well, you couldn't be more delighted than I was surprised," I said. "I never thought to see you in Wrychester. What brought you here, if one may ask? Sightseeing?" He laughed at that, and he pulled out his purse again. "I'll show you something, a secret," he said, and he took a bit of folded paper out of his purse. "What do you make of that?" he asked. "Can you read Latin?" "No, except a word or two," I said, "but I know a man who can." "Ah, never mind," said he. "I know enough Latin for this, and it's a secret. However, it won't be a secret long, and you'll hear all about it." And with that he put the bit of paper in his purse again, and we began talking about other matters, and before long he said he'd promised to have a chat with the gentleman at the Mitre, whom he'd come along with in the train, and away he went, saying he'd see me before he left the town. "Did he say how long he was going to stop here?" asked Bryce. 2 or 3 days, replied Harker. "Did he mention Ransford?" inquired Bryce. "Never," said Harker. "Did he make any reference to his wife and children?" "Not the slightest." "Nor to the hint that his counsel threw out at the trial?" "Never referred to that time except in the way I told you, that he hadn't a penny of the money himself, and that he'd himself refunded it." Bryce meditated a while. He was somewhat puzzled by certain points in the old detective's story, and he saw that there was much more mystery in the Braden affair than he had at first believed. "Well," he asked after a while, "did you see him again?" "Not alive," replied Harker. "I saw him dead, and I held my tongue, and have held it. But something happened that day. After I heard of the accident, I went into the Crown and Cushion Tavern. The fact was, I went to get a taste of whisky, for the news had upset me. And in that long bar of theirs, I saw a man whom I knew for a fact to have been a fellow convict of Brake's, name of Glassdale, forgery. He got the same sentence that Brake got, about the same time, was in the same convict prison with Brake, and he and Brake would be released about the same date. There was no doubt about his identity. I never forget a face, even after 30 years I'd tell one. I saw him in that bar before he saw me, and I took a careful look at him. He, too, like Brake, was very well dressed and very prosperous looking. He turned as he set down his glass and caught sight of me, and he knew me. Mind you, he'd been through my hands in times past. And he instantly moved to a side door and vanished. I went out and looked up and down. He'd gone. I found out afterwards, by a little quiet inquiry, that he'd gone straight to the station, boarded the first train, there was one just giving out to the junction, and left the city. But I can lay hands on him. "You've kept this quiet, too?" asked Bryce. "Just so. I've my own game to play," replied Harker. "This talk with you is part of it. You come in now. I'll tell you why, presently. But first, as you know, I went to Barthorpe. For though Brake was dead, I felt I must go, for this reason. I was certain that he wanted that information for himself. The man in Australia was a fiction. I went then, and learned nothing, except that this Falconer Wraye had been, as Brake said, a Barthorpe man years ago. He'd left the town 18 years since. Nobody knew anything about him. So I came home. And now then, Doctor, your turn. What were you after down there at Barthorpe?" Bryce meditated his answer for a good 5 minutes. He had always intended to play the game off his own bat, but he had heard and seen enough since entering Harker's little room to know that he was in company with an intellect which was keener and more subtle than his, and that it would be all to his advantage to go in with the man who had vast and deep experience. And so he made a clean breast of all he had done in the way of investigation, leaving his motive completely aside. "You've got a theory, of course," observed Harker, after listening quietly to all that Bryce could tell. Naturally you have. You couldn't accumulate all that without getting one. Well, admitted Bryce, honestly, I can't say that I have. But I can see what theory there might be. This, that Ransford was the man who deceived Brake, that he ran away with Brake's wife, that she's dead, and that he's brought up the children in ignorance of all that, and therefore, interrupted Harker with a smile, that when he and Brake met, as you seem to think they did, Ransford flung Brake through that open doorway, that Collishaw witnessed it, that Ransford found out about Collishaw, and that Collishaw has been poisoned by Ransford, eh? That's a theory that seems to be supported by facts, said Bryce. It's a theory that would doubtless suit men like Mitchington, said the old detective with another smile. But not me, sir. Mind you, I don't say there isn't something in it. There's doubtless a lot. But the mystery's a lot thicker than just that. And Brake didn't come here to find Ransford. He came because of the secret in that scrap of paper. And as you've got it, Doctor, out with it. Bryce saw no reason for concealment, and producing the scrap of paper, laid it on the table between himself and his host. Harker peered inquisitively at it. Latin, he said. You can read it, of course. What does it say? Bryce repeated a literal translation. I've found the place, he added. I found it this morning. Now, what do you suppose this means? Harker was looking hard at the 2 lines of writing. That's a big question, Doctor, he answered. But I'll go so far as to say this. When we found out what it does mean, we shall know a lot more than we know now. End of chapter 14. Read by Anita in Boston in January 2007.
The Paradise Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kirsten Ferrari. The Paradise Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 15. The Double Offer. Bryce, who was deriving a considerable and peculiar pleasure from his secret interview with the old detective, smiled at Harker's last remark. "That's a bit of a platitude, isn't it?" he suggested. "Of course we shall know a lot more, when we do know a lot more." "I set store by platitudes, sir," retorted Harker. "You can't repeat an established platitude too often. It's got the hallmark of good use on it. But now, till we do know more, you've no doubt been thinking a lot about this matter, Dr. Bryce. Hasn't it struck you that there's one feature in connection with Brake or Braden's visit to Wrychester to which nobody's given any particular attention up to now, so far as we know at any rate?" "What?" demanded Bryce. "This," replied Harker. "Why did he wish to see the Duke of Saxonsteade? He certainly did want to see him, and as soon as possible. You'll remember that his Grace was questioned about that at the inquest, and could give no explanation. He knew nothing of Brake, and couldn't suggest any reason why Brake should wish to have an interview with him. But I can." "You?" exclaimed Bryce. "I," answered Harker. "And it's this. I spoke just now of that man Glassdale. Now, you, of course, have no knowledge of him, and as you don't keep yourself posted in criminal history, you don't know what his offence was." "You said forgery?" replied Bryce. "Just so, forgery," assented Harker. "And the signature that he forged was the Duke of Saxonsteade's. As a matter of fact, he was the Duke's London estate agent. He got wrong somehow, and he forged the Duke's name to a cheque. Now, then, considering who Glassdale is, and that he was certainly a fellow-convict of Brake's, and that I myself saw him here in Wrychester on the day of Brake's death, what's a conclusion to be drawn? That Brake wanted to see the Duke on some business of Glassdale's, without a doubt. It may have been that he and Glassdale wanted to visit the Duke together." Bryce silently considered this suggestion for a while. "You said just now that Glassdale could be traced," he remarked at last. "Traced? Yes," replied Harker, "so long as he's in England." "Why not set about it?" suggested Bryce. Not yet, said Harker. There's things to do before that. And the first thing is, let's get to know what the mystery of that scrap of paper is. You say you've found Richard Jenkins's tomb? Very well. Then the thing to do is to find out if anything is hidden there. Try it tomorrow night. Better go yourself after dark. If you find anything, let me know. And then we can decide on a next step. But between now and then there'll be the inquest on this man Collishaw. And about that, a word in your ear. Say as little as ever you can. After all, you know nothing beyond what you saw. And we mustn't meet and talk in public. After you've done that bit of exploring in Paradise tomorrow night, come round here and we'll consider matters. There was little that Bryce could say, or could be asked to say, at the inquest on the mason's labour next morning. Public interest and excitement was as keen about Collishaw's mysterious death as about Braden's, for it was already rumoured throughout the town that if Braden had not met with his death when he came to Wrychester, Collishaw would still be alive. The coroner's court was once more packed. Once more there was the same atmosphere of mystery. But the proceedings were of a very different nature to those which had attended the inquest on Braden. The foreman under whose orders Collishaw had been working gave particulars of the dead man's work on the morning of his death. He had been instructed to clear away an accumulation of rubbish which had gathered at the foot of the south wall of the nave in consequence of some recent repairs to the masonry. There was a full day's work before him. All day he would be in and out of Paradise with his barrow, wheeling away the rubbish he gathered up. The foreman had looked in on him once or twice. He had seen him just before noon, when he appeared to be in his usual health. He had made no complaint at any rate. Asked if he had happened to notice where Collishaw had set down his dinner basket and his tin bottle while he worked, he replied that it so happened that he had. He remembered seeing both bottle and basket, and the man's jacket deposited on one of the box tombs, under a certain yew tree, which he could point out if necessary. Bryce's account of his finding of Collishaw amounted to no more than a bare recital of facts, nor was much time spent in questioning the two doctors who had conducted the post-mortem examination. Their evidence, terse and particular, referred solely to the cause of death. The man had been poisoned by a dose of hydrocyanic acid, which, in their opinion, had been taken only a few minutes before his body was discovered by Dr. Bryce. It had probably been a dose which would cause instantaneous death. There were no traces of the poison in the remains of his dinner, nor in the liquid in his tin bottle, which was old tea. But of the cause of his sudden death there was no more doubt than of the effects. Ransford had been in the court from the outset of the proceedings, and when the medical evidence had been given, he was called. Bryce, watching him narrowly, saw that he was suffering from repressed excitement, and that excitement was as much due to anger as to anything else. His face was set and stern, and he looked at the coroner with an expression which portended something not precisely clear at that moment. Bryce, trying to analyse it, said to himself that he shouldn't be surprised if a scene followed. Ransford looked like a man who is bursting to say something in no unmistakable fashion. But at first he answered the questions put to him calmly and decisively. "When this man's clothing was searched," observed the coroner, "a box of pills was found, Dr. Ransford, on which your writing appears. Had you been attending him professionally?" "Yes," replied Ransford, "both Collishaw and his wife. Or rather, to be exact, I had been in attendance on the wife for some weeks. A day or two before his death, Collishaw complained to me of indigestion following on his meals. I gave him some digestive pills, the pills you speak of, no doubt." "These?" asked the coroner, passing over the box which Mitchington had found. "Precisely," agreed Ransford. "That, at any rate, is the box, and I suppose those to be the pills." "You made them up yourself?" inquired the coroner. "I did. I dispense all my own medicines." "Is it possible that the poison we have heard of, just now, could get into one of these pills by accident?" "Utterly impossible, under my hands at any rate," answered Ransford. "Still, I suppose it could have been administered in a pill," suggested the coroner. "It might," agreed Ransford. "But," he added, with a significant glance at the medical men who had just given evidence, "it was not so administered in this case, as the previous witnesses very well know." The coroner looked round him and waited a moment. "You are at liberty to explain that last remark," he said at last. That is, if you wish to do so." "Certainly," answered Ransford with alacrity. "Those pills are, as you will observe, coated, and the man would swallow them whole, immediately after his food. Now it would take some little time for a pill to dissolve, to disintegrate, to be digested. If Collishaw took one of my pills as soon as he had eaten his dinner, according to instructions, and if poison had been in that pill, he would not have died at once, as he evidently did. Death would probably have been delayed some little time, until the pill had dissolved. But according to the evidence you have had before you, he died quite suddenly while eating his dinner, or immediately after it. I am not legally represented here. I don't consider it at all necessary. But I ask you to recall Dr. Coates and to put this question to him. Did he find one of those digestive pills in this man's stomach?" The coroner turned somewhat dubiously to the two doctors who had performed the autopsy. But before he could speak, the superintendent of police rose and began to whisper to him, and after a conversation between them, he looked round at the jury, every member of which had evidently been much struck by Ransford's suggestion. "At this stage," he said, "it will be necessary to adjourn. I shall adjourn the inquiry for a week, gentlemen. You will—" Ransford, still standing in the witness box, suddenly lost control of himself. He uttered a sharp exclamation and smote the ledge before him smartly with his open hand. "I protest against that!" he said vehemently. "Emphatically I protest! You, first of all, make a suggestion which tells against me. Then, when I demand that a question shall be put which is of immense importance to my interests, you close down the inquiry, even if only for the moment. That is grossly unfair and unjust." "You are mistaken," said the coroner. "At the adjourned inquiry the two medical men can be recalled, and you will have the opportunity, or your solicitor will have, of asking any questions you like for the present." "For the present you have me under suspicion!" interrupted Ransford hotly. "You know it! I say this with due respect to your office, as well as I do. Suspicion is rife in the city against me. Rumour is being spread secretly, and, I am certain, from the police, who ought to know better. And I will not be silenced, Mr. Coroner. I take this public opportunity, as I am on oath, of saying that I know nothing whatever of the causes of the deaths of either Collishaw or of Braden, upon my solemn oath." "The inquest is adjourned to this day week," said the coroner quietly. Ransford suddenly stepped down from the witness box, and without word or glance at anyone there, walked with set face and determined look out of the court, and the excited spectators, gathering into groups, immediately began to discuss his vigorous outburst and to take sides for and against him. Bryce, judging it advisable to keep away from Mitchington just then, and for similar reasons keeping away from Harker also, went out of the crowded building alone, to be joined in the street outside by Sackville Bonham, whom he had noticed in court, in company with his stepfather, Mr. Folliot. Folliot, Bryce had observed, had stopped behind, exchanging some conversation with the coroner. Sackville came up to Bryce with a knowing shake of the head. He was one of those very young men who have a habit of suggesting that their fund of knowledge is extensive and peculiar, and Bryce waited for a manifestation. "Queer business, all that, Bryce," observed Sackville confidentially. "Of course, Ransford is a perfect ass." "Think so?" remarked Bryce, with an inflection which suggested that Sackville's opinion on anything was as valuable as the Attorney General's. "That's how it strikes you, is it?" "Impossible that it could strike one in any other way, you know," answered Sackville with fine and lofty superiority. "Ransford should have taken immediate steps to clear himself of any suspicion. It's ridiculous, considering his position, guardian to Miss Bewery, for instance, that he should allow such rumours to circulate. By God, sir, if it had been me, I'd have stopped 'em before they left the parish pump." "Ah?" said Bryce. "And how?" "Made an example of somebody," replied Sackville with emphasis. "I believe there's law in this country, isn't there? Law against libel and slander and that sort of thing, eh? Oh, yes." "Not been much time for that yet," remarked Bryce. "Piles of time!" retorted Sackville, swinging his stick vigorously. "No, sir, Ransford is an ass. However, if a man won't do things for himself, well, his friends must do something for him. Ransford, of course, must be pulled, dragged out of this infernal hole. Of course he's suspected. But my stepfather, he's going to take a hand. And my stepfather, Bryce, is a devilish cute old hand at a game of this sort." "Nobody doubts Mr. Folliot's abilities, I'm sure," said Bryce. "But you don't mind saying, how is he going to take a hand?" "Stir things toward a clearing up," announced Sackville promptly. "Have the whole thing gone into, thoroughly. There are matters that haven't been touched on yet. You'll see, my boy." "Glad to hear it," said Bryce. "But why should Mr. Folliot be so particular about clearing Ransford?" Sackville swung his stick, and pulled up his collar, and jerked his nose a trifle higher. "Oh, well," he said, "of course it's a pretty well understood thing, don't you know? Between myself and Miss Bewery, you know. And of course we couldn't have any suspicions attaching to her guardian, could we now? Family interest, don't you know? Caesar's wife and all that sort of thing, eh?" "I see," answered Bryce quietly. "Sort of family arrangement. With Ransford's consent and knowledge, of course." "Ransford won't even be consulted," said Sackville airily. "My stepfather sharp man that, Bryce. He'll do things in his own fashion. You look out for sudden revelations." "I will," replied Bryce. "Bye-bye." He turned off to his rooms, wondering how much of truth there was in the fatuous Sackville's remarks, and was there some mystery still undreamt of by himself and Harker? There might be. He was still under the influence of Ransford's indignant and dramatic assertion of his innocence. Would Ransford have allowed himself an outburst of that sort if he had not been, as he said, utterly ignorant of the immediate cause of Braden's death? Now Bryce, all through, was calculating, for his own purposes, on Ransford's share, full or partial, in that death. If Ransford really knew nothing whatever about it, where did his, Bryce's, theory come in? And how would his present machinations result? And more, if Ransford's assertion were true, and if Varner's story of the hand, seen for an instant in the archway, were also true, and Varner was persisting in it, then who was the man who flung Braden to his death that morning? He realized that, instead of straightening out, things were becoming more and more complicated. But he realized something else. On the surface, there was a strong case of suspicion against Ransford. It had been suggested that very morning before a coroner and his jury. It would grow. The police were already permeated with suspicion and distrust. Would it not pay him, Bryce, to encourage, to help it? He had his own score to pay off against Ransford. He had his own schemes as regards Mary Bewery. Anyway, he was not going to share in any attempts to clear the man who had bundled him out of his house unceremoniously. He would bide his time. And in the meantime there were other things to be done, one of them that very night. But before Bryce could engage in his secret task of excavating a small portion of paradise in the rear of Richard Jenkins's tomb, another strange development came. As the dark fell over the old city that night, and he was thinking of setting out on his mission, Mitchington came in, carrying 2 sheets of paper, obviously damp from the press, in his hand. He looked at Bryce with an expression of wonder. "Here's a queer go," he said. "I can't make this out at all. Look at these big handbills, but perhaps you've seen 'em. They're being posted all over the city. We've had a bundle of 'em thrown in on us." "I haven't been out since lunch," remarked Bryce. "What are they?" Mitchington spread out the 2 papers on the table, pointing from one to the other. "You see," he said, £500 reward, £1,000 reward, and both out at the same time from different sources." "What sources?" asked Bryce, bending over the bills. "Ah, I see. One signed by Phipps and Maynard, the other by Beechcroft. Odd, certainly." "Odd!" exclaimed Mitchington. "I should think so! But do you see, Doctor, that one, 500 reward, is offered for information of any nature relative to the deaths of John Braden and James Collishaw, both or either. That amount will be paid for satisfactory information by Phipps and Maynard. And Phipps and Maynard are Ransford's solicitors. That bill, sir, comes from him. And now the other, the £1,000 one that offers the reward to anyone who can give definite information as to the circumstances attending the death of John Braden, to be paid by Mr. Beechcroft. And he's Mr. Folliot's solicitor. So that comes from Mr. Folliot. What has he to do with it? And are these two putting their heads together? Or are these bills quite independent of each other? Hang me if I understand it." Bryce read and reread the contents of the two bills, and then he thought for a while before speaking. "Well," he said at last, "there's probably this in it. The Folliots are very wealthy people. Mrs. Folliot, it's pretty well known, wants her son to marry Miss Bewery, Dr. Ransford's ward. Probably she doesn't wish any suspicion to hang over the family. That's all I can suggest. In the other case, Ransford wants to clear himself. For don't forget this, Mitchington. Somewhere, somebody may know something. Only something, but that something might clear Ransford of the suspicion that's undoubtedly been cast upon him. If you're thinking to get a strong case against Ransford, you've got your work set. He gave your theory a nasty knock this morning by his few words about the pill. Did Coates and Everest find a pill, now?" "Not at liberty to say, sir," answered Mitchington. "At present, anyway. I dislike these private offers of reward. It means that those who make 'em get hold of information which is kept back from us, do you see? They're inconvenient." Then he went away, and Bryce, after waiting a while, until night had settled down, slipped quietly out of the house and set off for the gloom of Paradise. End of chapter 15.